The cotton sheets beneath him felt cold and uninviting, mirroring the vast emptiness that had settled deep within his heart. As he stirred awake, the familiar weight of loneliness pressed down on his chest, heavy and unyielding, like an unwelcome companion that refused to leave. Before we continue, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. David's eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the dim light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows that framed a view most would consider paradise. But for him, it was just another reminder of how far he'd come from the dusty roads of rural Texas and how much he'd lost along the way. With a deep sigh that seemed to echo through the cavernous master suite, David pushed himself up, his feet touching the cool marble floor. Each morning, this simple act felt like stepping onto a stage, preparing to play the role of the successful businessman, the self-made millionaire. But lately, the performance had begun to feel hollow, the applause of his bank account ringing false in his ears. As he padded across the room, his reflection caught his eye in the expansive mirror. Gray had begun to streak his once jet-black hair, and lines had etched themselves around his eyes, not laugh lines, but furrows carved by years of stress and single-minded ambition. David hardly recognized the man staring back at him, a stranger wearing the mask of success, but harboring the soul of a man adrift. His gaze drifted to a framed photograph on the dresser, its presence both a comfort and a knife to his heart. Sarah's smile beamed at him from behind the glass, frozen in time, eternally youthful and full of life. His late wife's eyes seemed to follow him, a constant reminder of the promises he'd made and failed to keep. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "I've let you down. I've let Ethan down." The mention of his son's name sent a fresh wave of pain through him. Ethan, now 17, was practically a stranger to him. The vibrant, curious boy who once looked at David with adoration had been replaced by a sullen teenager who could barely meet his father's eyes across the dinner table, on the rare occasions they shared a meal. David's mind drifted back to the countless missed baseball games, school plays, and parent-teacher conferences, each one a brick in the wall that now stood between him and his son. He'd always told himself it was for Ethan's future, that every missed moment was an investment in a life of comfort and opportunity. But standing in the cold light of dawn, surrounded by the trappings of his success, David realized the terrible price of his ambition. As he moved through his morning routine, a sharp suit, a quick coffee, a glance at the financial news, David felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The house bustled with the quiet efficiency of his staff, but their presence only underscored his isolation. Maids, a chef, a gardener, all these people moved through his life, maintaining the illusion of a perfect existence, but none could fill the void left by genuine human connection. Just as he was about to leave for another day of empire building, his phone buzzed insistently. The caller ID displayed Westridge Academy, Ethan's prestigious private school. David's heart rate quickened, a mix of concern and, if he was honest with himself, a touch of annoyance at the disruption to his schedule. "Mr. Langston," the crisp voice of Principal Hawthorne cut through the line. "I'm afraid we need to discuss Ethan. It's rather urgent. Can you come in this morning?" The words hit David like a physical blow. In all his years of chasing success, he'd never once been called to the school for an urgent matter concerning his son. For the first time in years, David Langston felt the stirring of something long dormant within him, the fierce, protective love of a father determined to make things right. The Pacific Coast Highway unfurled before David like a ribbon of possibilities, each curve and straightaway a metaphor for the twists and turns his life had taken. The Tesla hummed beneath him, a testament to his material success. But as the familiar landmarks of his daily commute slipped by, David found himself on an altogether different journey, one that led inward to the neglected corners of his heart. To his right, the vast expanse of the Pacific stretched to the horizon, its azure waters glinting in the morning sun. The beauty that had once filled him with a sense of accomplishment. After all, wasn't this view the very reason he'd worked so hard? Now seemed to mock him with its indifference to his inner turmoil. As he navigated the winding road, memories washed over him like the waves crashing against the cliffs below. He remembered the day Ethan was born, how tiny and perfect he had seemed, wrapped in a blue blanket and cradled in Sarah's arms. The overwhelming love he had felt in that moment had been unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It was a love that promised protection, guidance, and unwavering presence. A bitter laugh escaped David's lips, startling him with its harshness. How far he had strayed from that promise, from the man he had sworn to be on that day 17 years ago. The car's navigation system chimed, announcing his approach to Westridge Academy. The sprawling campus came into view, its manicured lawns and stately buildings a physical manifestation of the privilege David had worked so hard to provide for his son. Yet as he pulled into the parking lot, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was arriving as a stranger, an outsider to his own child's life. David took a deep breath, straightening his tie as if armor against the coming confrontation. The walk to the principal's office felt like a march to the gallows, each step heavy with the weight of years of neglect. Principal Hawthorne's office was a study in understated elegance, much like the man himself. Silver-haired and rail-thin, Hawthorne regarded David with a mix of sympathy and disappointment that made David want to squirm in his seat like a schoolboy. "Mr. Langston?" Hawthorne began, his voice carrying the gravitas of his position. "I'll be frank. Ethan is struggling. His grades have plummeted. He's been skipping classes, and there have been incidents." The word incidents hung in the air between them, pregnant with unspoken implications. David's mind raced, trying to reconcile this image of a troubled teen with the quiet boy he occasionally saw at home. "What kind of incidents?" David managed to ask, his throat suddenly dry. Hawthorne sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Nothing criminal, thankfully, but he's been caught smoking on campus, has gotten into verbal altercations with teachers, and last week, he vandalized the chemistry lab." Each revelation felt like a physical blow. David's mind reeled, trying to process this information about a son he realized he barely knew. "Mr. Langston," Hawthorne continued, his tone softening slightly, "Ethan is a bright boy. He has potential, but he's angry, unmotivated. He needs guidance, support. The unspoken accusation hung heavy in the air. He needs a father." Before David could formulate a response, the office door swung open. Ethan slouched in, his school uniform disheveled, a defiant set to his jaw. For a moment, father and son locked eyes, and David was struck by how much Ethan looked like Sarah. The same expressive brown eyes, now clouded with a storm of emotions. "Ethan," David began, but the words died in his throat as his son's gaze hardened. "Save it," Ethan spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "I know you're only here because they made you come. Don't pretend you actually care." The venom in Ethan's words stung, but it was the pain behind them that truly cut David to the quick. In that moment, he saw not the angry teenager before him, but the little boy who used to run to him with skinned knees and bad dreams, seeking comfort and protection. "That's not true," David protested weakly, but even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow. Ethan's laugh was a bitter, broken sound that seemed to fill the room. "Right, because you've been so present all these years. Tell me, Dad, do you even know what grade I'm in? My favorite subject? The name of a single one of my friends?" Each question was a dagger, precisely aimed at David's deepest insecurities. The worst part was, he realized with a sinking feeling, he couldn't answer a single one. "That's what I thought," Ethan said, the fight suddenly going out of him. He slumped into a chair, looking utterly defeated. "You care more about your money than you ever cared about me or Mom." The mention of Sarah seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. David felt as if he'd been struck, the truth of Ethan's words reverberating through him like a physical blow. Principal Hawthorne cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding in his office. "Perhaps it would be best if you two continued this discussion in private. Mr. Langston, given the circumstances, I think it would be wise for Ethan to take some time away from school, to sort things out." David nodded numbly, barely registering the principal's words. His entire focus was on Ethan, on the chasm that yawned between them, seemingly unbridgeable. As they left the office, the silence between them was deafening. They walked side by side, yet worlds apart, down the hallway lined with achievements of students past and present. Trophies, Awards and accolades glinted in their cases, mocking David with the realization that none of his own accomplishments meant anything in the face of his greatest failure. They reached the parking lot, the California sun now high in the sky, its warmth at odds with the chill that had settled in David's heart. Ethan paused by the car, his hand on the door handle, but made no move to get in. "Ethan," David tried again, reaching out to place a hand on his son's shoulder. Ethan flinched away as if burned, and David let his hand fall limply to his side. "Just don't," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't need your excuses or your guilt. I stopped needing you a long time ago." With that, he wrenched open the car door and slid inside, leaving David standing alone in the parking lot, the weight of his failures threatening to crush him. The drive home was silent, the tension so thick it seemed to press against the windows of the car. David's mind raced, replaying every moment of the confrontation, searching desperately for the right words to bridge the gulf between them. But every time he opened his mouth to speak, the words died on his lips, inadequate in the face of years of neglect. As they wound their way back along the coast, the beauty that had earlier seemed indifferent now felt like an affront. How dare the world continue to be so breathtaking when everything in David's life was falling apart? They pulled into the driveway of their mansion, the house looming before them like a mausoleum to David's misplaced priorities. Ethan was out of the car before it had fully stopped, slamming the door and stalking toward the house without a backward glance. David sat in the car for a long moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The enormity of what he stood to lose, what he had already lost, crashed over him in waves. With a heavy heart, he finally exited the car, his feet carrying him not towards the house, but toward the cliff's edge that bordered their property. The sun was beginning its descent towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink that would have been breathtaking under any other circumstances. David stood there, watching the relentless rhythm of the waves below, feeling more lost than he ever had in his life. The empire he had built, the wealth he had accumulated, all of it seemed meaningless in the face of his son's pain and disappointment. As the sky darkened and the first stars began to appear, David made a decision. It wasn't too late. It couldn't be too late. Somehow, some way, he would find a way to reconnect with Ethan, to be the father his son deserved, the man Sarah had always believed he could be. With a new resolve burning in his chest, David turned back towards the house. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with the potential for more pain and rejection. But for the first time in years, David felt a flicker of hope. He had spent his entire adult life building a fortune. Now it was time to build something far more valuable, a relationship with his son. The next morning dawned with a clarity that seemed almost surreal to David. As the first rays of sunlight crept through his bedroom window, he lay awake, his mind churning with the enormity of the decision he had made the night before. For years, his days had begun with a flurry of activity, checking emails, making calls, plotting his next business move. But today, as he reached for his phone, he hesitated. Instead of opening his email, he pulled up his calendar and, with a sense of both trepidation and liberation, began canceling every appointment for the foreseeable future. Each swipe of his finger felt like dismantling a piece of the life he had built, but also like clearing the way for something new, something vital. When he reached his board meeting, scheduled for later that morning, he paused. This would be the point of no return. With a deep breath, David composed an email that would shock the business world. To the board of directors, effective immediately, I am resigning from my position as CEO of Langston Enterprises. Personal matters require my full attention, and I can no longer in good conscience lead this company while neglecting what truly matters in my life. I have full confidence in the leadership team we have built to guide the company forward. My shares will be placed in a trust, with instructions to prioritize ethical business practices and employee welfare over short-term profits. It has been an honor to work with all of you. David Langston. His finger hovered over the send button for a long moment before he finally pressed it, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders even as a new one settled in its place, the weight of responsibility to his son, to the family he had neglected for so long. Text here, during which David could almost feel the weight of Ethan's deliberation. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing Ethan's face, a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and a flicker of something that might have been hope. David stepped into the room, taking in the space that was so familiar, yet so foreign to him. Posters of bands he didn't recognize adorned the walls, a guitar leaned in one corner, and a desk cluttered with school books and a laptop spoke of a life he had been largely absent from. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, his posture guarded. David, unsure where to position himself, opted for the desk chair, turning it to face his son. "I resigned from the company today," David began, deciding that honesty and directness were the best approach. "All of it. I'm stepping away completely." Ethan's eyes widened in surprise, but his voice remained cautious when he spoke. "Why? What's the catch?" The question stung, but David knew he deserved it. "No catch. I realized something yesterday, Ethan. I realized that I've been chasing the wrong things, valuing the wrong measure of success. I thought I was building a legacy, something to pass on to you. But in doing so, I nearly lost the most important thing in my life. You." Ethan's expression softened almost imperceptibly, but he remained silent, waiting for David to continue. "I know I can't make up for lost time," David went on, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't go back and be at your baseball games or help with your science projects. But I'm here now, and I want to know you, Ethan. The real you. Not just the son I imagined while I was busy building an empire, but the person you've become." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for this level of vulnerability from his father. "And what if you don't like who I've become?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hit David like a physical blow. He leaned forward, meeting Ethan's gaze with an intensity born of years of regret and newfound determination. "Ethan, listen to me. There is nothing, absolutely nothing you could do or be that would make me not love you. I know I haven't shown it well or often enough, but you are the most important person in my life. You're my son, and I love you unconditionally." Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes, mirroring the moisture gathering in David's own. For a moment, the years of distance between them seemed to collapse, and David saw not the angry teenager of yesterday, but the little boy who used to run to him with scraped knees and triumphant smiles. "I miss Mom," Ethan said suddenly, his voice cracking. "She always knew how to make things better." David felt a lump form in his throat. "I miss her too, son, every day, and I know she would be so disappointed in how I've handled things since she's been gone, but I also know she'd want us to find our way back to each other." He paused, gathering his courage for what he wanted to propose next. "I have an idea, Ethan. It might sound crazy, but hear me out. What if we took a trip together? Just you and me. No phones, no distractions. Maybe up to that cabin in the Rockies your mom and I used to take you to when you were little. We could hike, fish, talk, or not talk, whatever you want. I just want a chance to get to know you again, and for you to get to know me, the real me, not just the workaholic you've seen these past few years." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. David held his breath, realizing how much was riding on his son's response. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice a mixture of hesitation and a tiny spark of hope. "I don't know, Dad. It's been a long time since we've done anything like that. What if it doesn't work? What if we just end up arguing the whole time?" David nodded, understanding his son's reservations. "That's a fair concern, Ethan, and I can't promise it will be perfect. We might argue. We might have awkward silences. But I can promise you this. I will be there, fully present, ready to listen and to try. That's all I'm asking for, a chance to try. Can you give me that?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. David watched as a myriad of emotions played across Ethan's face: doubt, fear, longing, and finally a tentative acceptance. "Okay," Ethan said softly. "I'll go, but I'm not promising anything, all right? I'm willing to try too." The relief that washed over David was so profound he felt lightheaded. He resisted the urge to pull Ethan into a hug, sensing that his son wasn't quite ready for that level of physical closeness yet. Instead, he smiled. a genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time in what felt like years. "Thank you, Ethan. That's all I can ask for. We'll leave whenever you're ready. Take your time to pack. Think about what you might want to do up there. This trip is about you, about us. No agenda, no expectations, just a father and son trying to find their way back to each other." As David stood to leave, giving Ethan space to process everything, he felt a glimmer of hope ignite in his chest. It was a small flame, fragile and flickering, but it was there. And for the first time in too long, David Langston felt like he might be on the right path, not to success as the world defined it, but to something far more valuable, a real relationship with his son. As he closed Ethan's door behind him, David sent up a silent prayer of thanks to Sarah. He could almost feel her presence, her approval of this first step towards healing. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with uncomfortable conversations and painful revelations, but David was ready. Ready to face his failures, to listen, to learn, and most importantly, to be the father Ethan deserved. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. David tied up loose ends at the company, ignoring the barrage of calls and emails expressing shock at his sudden departure. His focus was singular now, Ethan and the upcoming trip that held so much potential for healing and reconnection. As the day of their departure dawned, David found himself standing in the driveway, loading their bags into his old SUV, a far cry from his usual luxury vehicles, but perfect for the rugged mountain roads they'd be traversing. Ethan emerged from the house, backpack slung over one shoulder, his expression a mix of apprehension and a hint of excitement he couldn't quite hide. "Ready?" David asked, trying to keep his voice casual despite the nervous energy thrumming through him. Ethan nodded, tossing his bag into the back before climbing into the passenger seat. As David settled behind the wheel, he cast one last glance at the mansion behind them. For the first time, he saw it not as a symbol of his success, but as the gilded cage it had become, a place where true connections had withered in the pursuit of wealth and status. As they pulled out of the driveway, leaving behind the trappings of their old life, David felt a sense of lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The road stretched out before them, winding its way towards the mountains, and, he hoped, towards a new beginning for both of them. The first hour of the drive passed in relative silence, the radio providing a buffer against the awkwardness that still lingered between them. But as the urban sprawl of Los Angeles gave way to more open landscapes, David decided it was time to start bridging the gap. "So," he began, keeping his eyes on the road, "tell me about school. What subjects do you enjoy?" Ethan shifted in his seat, clearly caught off guard by the simple question. I guess I like English and art. Mr. Ramirez, the art teacher, he's pretty cool." David nodded, encouraging Ethan to continue. "Art? I didn't know you were into that. What kind of art do you do?" A small smile played at the corners of Ethan's mouth. "Mostly sketching, sometimes painting. I've been working on this series of urban landscapes, trying to capture the feeling of the city at night." David felt a pang of regret at how little he knew about his son's interests. "That sounds amazing, Ethan. I'd love to see your work sometime, if you're willing to show me." Ethan shrugged, but David could see a flicker of pride in his eyes. "Maybe. I've got some sketches in my bag." As the miles rolled by, the conversation began to flow more easily. Ethan opened up about his friends, his favorite bands, and the books he'd been reading. David listened intently, asking questions and sharing his own thoughts, marveling at the intelligent, thoughtful young man his son had become. By the time they reached the winding mountain roads that led to their destination, the atmosphere in the car had shifted. The tension hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had eased, replaced by a cautious optimism that perhaps this trip wasn't such a bad idea after all. As David navigated the final turns leading to the cabin, memories of past family vacations flooded back. He could almost hear Sarah's laughter, see her smile as she pointed out wildlife to a wide-eyed young Ethan. The bittersweet ache of her absence was tempered by the knowledge that she would have been proud of this moment, of their effort to rebuild what had been broken. The cabin came into view, a sturdy log structure nestled among towering pines. David brought the car to a stop, turning to Ethan with a smile that held equal parts nervousness and hope. "Well, here we are, ready for this adventure?" Ethan looked out at the familiar yet changed landscape, then back at his father. For the first time in years, David saw a glimmer of the little boy who used to look at him with unquestioning trust and love. "Yeah, Dad," Ethan said softly. "I think I am." As they stepped out of the car, the crisp mountain air filled their lungs, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in too long, father and son were walking it together. The cabin stood as a sentinel of memories, its weathered logs and wide porch a testament to the passage of time. As David and Ethan approached, each step crunching on the gravel driveway, the years seemed to peel away. For a moment, David could almost see the ghosts of their past selves, a younger, less burdened version of himself, Sarah with her radiant smile, and little Ethan, full of wonder and energy. "It looks smaller than I remember," Ethan mused, breaking the spell of nostalgia that had settled over them. David chuckled softly. "I was thinking the same thing. Funny how our perspectives change as we grow." They climbed the porch steps, the old wood creaking beneath their feet. David fumbled with the key, a wave of emotion washing over him as he pushed open the door. The scent of pine and memories long dormant enveloped them. Inside, the cabin was just as they had left it years ago. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by comfortable, if slightly outdated furniture. The kitchen, visible through an open archway, was small but functional. A narrow staircase led to the loft where Ethan used to sleep, insisting he was old enough to have his own space even at the tender age of 8. Ethan wandered into the main room, his fingers trailing along the back of the worn leather couch. "I can't believe how much I remember," he said softly, more to himself than to David. "Mom's favorite chair, the bookshelf where she kept all those field guides." David's throat tightened at the mention of Sarah. "She loved it here," he managed, said it was where she felt most at peace. Their eyes met, a moment of shared grief passing between them. Then Ethan cleared his throat, the vulnerability of the moment clearly making him uncomfortable. "So, what's the plan? Are we just going to sit around and stare at each other for a week?" The sarcasm in Ethan's voice was unmistakable, but David chose to take the question at face value. "Well, I thought we could start by unpacking, maybe take a short hike to reacquaint ourselves with the area. There's a great spot by the river not far from here. After that, it's up to you. We could fish, explore some of the trails, or just relax. This time is about you, Ethan. What would you like to do?" Ethan seemed taken aback by the deference to his wishes. He shrugged, trying to maintain an air of nonchalance. "A hike sounds okay, I guess. And maybe we could build a fire later. It might get cold." David nodded, pleased by the suggestion. "That's a great idea. Why don't you take your things up to the loft and get settled? I'll unpack the groceries and we can head out in about an hour." As Ethan disappeared up the stairs, David busied himself in the kitchen, unpacking supplies and trying to quell the nervous energy that thrummed through him. He was acutely aware that every interaction, every word spoken or left unsaid, carried weight. The pressure to make this time count, to somehow bridge the chasm years of neglect had created, was immense. An hour later, they set out on the trail that wound behind the cabin and down to the river. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. David found himself pointing out different trees and plants, sharing snippets of knowledge Sarah had taught him on their many hikes together. To his surprise and delight, Ethan seemed genuinely interested, asking questions and even stopping to sketch a particularly gnarled old oak in a small notebook he'd pulled from his pocket. "That's really good," David said, peering over Ethan's shoulder at the quick but detailed sketch. "You've got a real talent there." Ethan shrugged, but David could see the pleased flush on his cheeks. "It's just a hobby." "Sometimes hobbies become passions, and passions become careers," David mused. "You know, your mom was an incredible artist. She used to talk about teaching art someday, when things settled down." Ethan's pencil stilled. "I didn't know that," he said quietly. "Why didn't she?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. David sighed, knowing it was time for some hard truths. Because of me, he admitted. My work, my ambitions, they always seemed to take precedence. I kept promising her someday, but someday never came. It's one of my biggest regrets. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the distant rush of the river growing louder as they approached. Finally, they emerged from the tree line onto a small, rocky beach. The river flowed swift and clear before them, the late afternoon sun glinting off its surface. David found a comfortable spot on a large, flat rock and sat down, patting the space beside him in invitation. Ethan hesitated for a moment before joining him, his legs dangling over the edge of the rock just above the water. "Ethan," David began, his voice soft but firm, "I owe you an apology. Not just for yesterday or last week or even last year. I owe you an apology for all the times I wasn't there, for all the moments I missed because I thought I was doing the right thing by providing for our future." Ethan stared out at the water, his face unreadable. "You were always talking about the future," he said. "But what about the present? What about now?" The words struck David like a physical blow. "You're right," he acknowledged. "I was so focused on building something for tomorrow that I forgot to live for today. I forgot what was truly important." He turned to face his son fully, willing Ethan to see the sincerity in his eyes. "I can't change the past, Ethan. I can't go back and be at your school plays or your baseball games. But I'm here now, and I'm asking for a chance to do better. To be better." Ethan finally turned to meet his father's gaze, his eyes a storm of conflicting emotions. "How do I know this isn't just another empty promise? How do I know you won't go back to being you once we leave this place?" The question hung between them, as tangible as the mist rising from the river. David took a deep breath, knowing his answer could be the turning point in their relationship. "Because I've realized something, Ethan. Something I should have known all along. All the money, all the success in the world means nothing if I don't have you in my life. I've been chasing the wrong dream, and it nearly cost me everything that truly matters." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I can't promise I'll be perfect. I'll make mistakes, I'm sure. But I can promise you this. From this moment on, you are my priority. Not work, not money, not status. You. And I'll spend every day proving that to you, if you'll let me." Ethan's eyes glistened with unshed tears. He looked away, blinking rapidly, his fingers absently tracing patterns on the rough surface of the rock. "I want to believe you, Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's hard. It's been so long." David nodded, understanding the weight of his son's words. "I know, and I don't expect you to trust me completely right away. Trust is earned, and I haven't done much to earn yours lately. But I'm asking for a chance. A chance to show you that I can change, that I want to change." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the rushing of the river and the distant call of a bird. Finally, Ethan spoke. "Okay," he said, his voice stronger now. "I'll give you a chance, but I'm not making any promises either. It's going to take time." Relief washed over David like a wave. He resisted the urge to pull Ethan into a hug, sensing his son wasn't quite ready for that level of physical closeness. Instead, he simply nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Time is something I have plenty of now," he said, "and I intend to use every minute of it to be the father you deserve." As the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the water, they sat in a silence that was no longer uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with potential, with the tentative beginnings of understanding. Eventually David stood, stretching his stiff muscles. "We should head back," he said. "It'll be dark soon, and I believe someone mentioned building a fire." Ethan nodded, a hint of enthusiasm creeping into his expression. "Yeah, that sounds good. I'm getting kind of hungry anyway." As they made their way back along the trail, the conversation flowed more easily. Ethan pointed out interesting plants and rock formations, showing a knowledge of nature that surprised and delighted David. In turn, David shared stories of his own childhood, of summers spent exploring the woods near his grandparents' farm in Texas. By the time they reached the cabin, the first stars were beginning to appear in the deepening twilight. Working together, they built a fire in the old stone fireplace, the familiar task bringing back memories of happier times. As the flames crackled and danced, casting a warm glow over the room, David and Ethan sat on the worn rug, plates of simple camp food balanced on their knees. The atmosphere was relaxed, the earlier tension melting away like snow in spring. "Hey, Dad," Ethan said suddenly, his voice hesitant. David looked up from his plate, giving his son his full attention. "Yes? Do you think Mom would be happy? Seeing us here like this?" The question caught David off guard, a lump forming in his throat. He took a moment to compose himself before answering. "I think she'd be overjoyed, Ethan. Your mom. She always believed in the power of second chances. She believed in the good in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. I think she'd be proud of us for trying, for taking this step." Ethan nodded, his eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. "I miss her," he said softly. "Sometimes I worry I'm forgetting things about her. The sound of her laugh, the way she'd hum when she was cooking." David felt his heart constrict. "I miss her too, son. Every day. But you know what? She's still with us in a way. I see her in you, in your kindness, your creativity, even in the way you furrow your brow when you're concentrating, just like she used to." A small smile played at the corners of Ethan's mouth. "Really?" "Really," David affirmed. "And any time you want to talk about her, to share memories, or just remember, I'm here. I'd love to hear about the times you had with her when I wasn't around as much as I should have been." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "I'd like that," he said. Maybe we could look at some old photo albums tomorrow? I think I saw some on the bookshelf earlier." David felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spread through his chest. "That sounds perfect, Ethan. I'd love nothing more." As the night wore on, their conversation drifted to lighter topics. Ethan's favorite bands, David's most embarrassing moments in business meetings, the plot of a book Ethan had recently read. There were still awkward pauses, moments where neither quite knew what to say, but they were fewer and farther between. When Ethan finally yawned and announced he was heading to bed, David felt a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't a miraculous transformation. There was still a long road ahead. But it was a start, a foundation upon which they could build. "Good night, Dad," Ethan said as he climbed the stairs to the loft. "Good night, son," David replied, the words feeling both familiar and new on his tongue. "Sleep well." Left alone by the dying fire, David allowed himself a moment of reflection. The day had been filled with more honest conversation than he and Ethan had shared in years. It had been uncomfortable at times, even painful, but it felt like a necessary cleansing, the lancing of a long, festering wound to allow true healing to begin. As he banked the fire for the night, David sent up a silent prayer of thanks to Sarah for the strength and love she had instilled in their son, to whatever force had finally opened his eyes to what truly mattered in life, and to Ethan for having the courage to give him this chance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for connection and understanding. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, David Langston went to sleep with a heart full of hope and a determination to be the father his son deserved. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight filtering through the cabin windows and casting warm patterns on the worn wooden floor. David woke early, his body still attuned to his usual schedule despite the change in surroundings. For a moment he lay still, listening to the sounds of the forest coming alive outside and the soft, rhythmic breathing from the loft above where Ethan slept. With a quiet groan, he pushed himself out of bed, his joints protesting slightly. The years of high-stress living and neglecting his physical health were making themselves known. But as he stretched, feeling the cool mountain air on his skin, David felt more alive than he had in years. He padded softly to the kitchen, intent on making breakfast before Ethan woke. As he rummaged through the cupboards, searching for the pancake mix he knew Sarah always kept stocked here, his hand brushed against something tucked in the back of a shelf. Curious, David pulled it out. It was a small, leather-bound notebook, its cover worn and creased with age. With a jolt, he recognized Sarah's handwriting on the first page, Langston Family Cabin Recipes and Memories. His heart racing, David opened the book, thumbing through pages filled with Sarah's neat script. There were recipes, yes. Her famous blueberry pancakes, hearty stews for cold nights, s'mores with a secret ingredient. But interspersed among them were little notes and observations. Ethan's first hike, he was so determined to make it all the way to the waterfall. David carried him half the way back, both of them grinning ear to ear. Full moon tonight. The lake looks like it's made of silver. Moments like these make me believe in magic. David actually left his phone at home this trip. We spent the whole day by the river, just talking and laughing. I'd almost forgotten how it felt to have him fully present. Note to self, make this happen more often. That last entry hit David like a physical blow. He remembered that day, how free he had felt without the constant pull of work, how he had promised himself to make more time for his family. A promise he had failed to keep. "Dad? What are you doing?" Ethan's voice startled David out of his reverie. He looked up to see his son standing at the bottom of the stairs, hair mussed from sleep, eyeing him curiously. "I found your mom's old recipe book," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd forgotten all about it." Ethan's eyes widened. He crossed the room in a few quick strides, peering over David's shoulder at the open pages. Is that Mom's handwriting?" he asked, reaching out to touch the paper gently, as if afraid it might crumble beneath his fingers. David nodded, carefully handing the book to Ethan. "It is. She kept a record of all our trips here. Recipes, memories, little moments she wanted to remember." Ethan cradled the book, his eyes scanning the pages hungrily. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth as he read. "I remember this," he said softly, pointing to an entry. "The time we tried to make s'mores in the fireplace and nearly burned the cabin down. Mom was so mad, but she couldn't stop laughing." David chuckled at the memory. "I'd forgotten about that. Your mother had a way of finding humor in even the most stressful situations." They stood there for a moment, sharing a comfortable silence as Ethan continued to flip through the pages. Finally, he looked up at David, his eyes shining with a mix of sadness and warmth. "Thanks for finding this, Dad," he said. It's like having a piece of her back, you know?" David nodded, understanding completely. "I know exactly what you mean, son. Listen, what do you say we try to recreate some of these recipes while we're here? Your mom's blueberry pancakes were legendary." Ethan's face lit up. "Really? You think we could make them taste like hers?" "Well, I can't promise they'll be quite as good," David said with a wry smile. "Your mom had a special touch in the kitchen that I could never quite match, but we can give it our best shot. What do you say?" "I say let's do it," Ethan replied, already flipping to the pancake recipe. "But fair warning, if we burn down the cabin trying to make s'mores later, I'm blaming you." David laughed, a full, hearty laugh that seemed to chase away the lingering shadows of the past. "Deal. Now, let's see if I remember where your mom used to hide the good maple syrup." As they bustled around the small kitchen, measuring flour and cracking eggs, David felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. This simple act of making breakfast with his son, laughing over shared memories, this was what he had been missing all those years chasing success. The pancakes, when they were finally ready, weren't quite as fluffy as Sarah's had always been. The edges were a little crispy, and more than one ended up slightly misshapen. But as David watched Ethan take his first bite, closing his eyes in appreciation, he knew they had created something far more valuable than a perfect breakfast. They had taken a step towards rebuilding their relationship, guided by the memories and love Sarah had left behind. And as the morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating Ethan's smile and the open pages of Sarah's book, David felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The path ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time, David truly believed they were on the right track. With Sarah's memory as their guide and the love that had always been there, buried beneath years of misunderstanding and neglect, they would find their way back to being a family. As Ethan launched into a story about a school art project, his eyes alight with enthusiasm, David made a silent promise. He would honor Sarah's memory not just by remembering the past, but by being fully present in the now and working towards a future where moments like this, simple, joyful, connected, were the rule rather than the exception. The journey wouldn't be easy, but sitting here in this cabin filled with memories and new beginnings, David knew it would be worth every step. As the days passed, David and Ethan fell into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings were spent exploring the trails around the cabin. Afternoons often found them by the river. Ethan sketching the landscape while David attempted to remember how to fish. And evenings were filled with conversations by the fire, ranging from light-hearted to deeply personal. It was on one such morning hike, about 4 days into their trip, that David decided it was time to address some of the harder truths he'd been avoiding. They had stopped to rest on a fallen log, the forest around them alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. "Ethan," David began, his voice serious, "I think it's time we talked about why I really brought you up here." Ethan looked up from the wildflower he'd been examining, his expression guarded. "I thought it was to bond or whatever," he said, a hint of his old sarcasm creeping into his voice. David nodded. "That's part of it, yes. But there's more to it than that. I owe you an explanation and an apology for a lot of things." He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he needed to say. "After your mom died, I didn't handle it well. I threw myself into work because it was easier than facing the grief, easier than looking at you and seeing her eyes, her smile." Ethan's face clouded, but he remained silent, waiting for David to continue. "I told myself I was doing it for you, that I was securing your future. But the truth is, I was running away. From the pain, from the responsibility of being a single parent, from the fear that I wouldn't be enough for you without her." David's voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. "I missed so much, Ethan. Your first day of high school, your art shows, your struggles and your triumphs. I can never get that time back, and I am so sorry for that." Ethan stared at the ground, his hands clenched in his lap. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I needed you, Dad. I needed you so much and you weren't there." The words hit David like a physical blow. "I know," he said softly, "and I will regret that for the rest of my life. But Ethan, I want you to know, it was never because I didn't love you. It was because I loved you so much that I was terrified of failing you." Ethan looked up then, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "But you did fail me, Dad, by not being there." David nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle on his shoulders. "You're right. I did fail you, and I can't change that. But I'm here now, and I'm asking for the chance to do better, to be the father you deserve." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Finally, Ethan spoke. "I want to believe you, Dad. I really do. But how do I know this isn't just another empty promise? How do I know you won't go back to your old ways once we leave here?" It was a fair question, and one David had anticipated. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to Ethan. "What's this?" Ethan asked, unfolding it cautiously. "It's my resignation letter," David explained. "I sent it to the board of directors the day before we left. I'm stepping down as CEO, effective immediately." Ethan's eyes widened in shock. You quit your job? But Dad, that company is your life. You built it from nothing." David shook his head, a sad smile playing at his lips. "No, Ethan, you're my life. You and your mom, you were always my life. I just lost sight of that for a while. The company, the money, the success, none of it means anything if I don't have you." Ethan stared at the letter, his hands trembling slightly. "But what will you do now?" "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure," David admitted. But I know I want to do something that matters, something that helps people. Maybe start a foundation or work with underprivileged kids. But more importantly, I want to be there for you, to support your dreams, to watch you grow into the incredible man I know you're becoming. Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes, spilling over onto his cheeks. Dad, I don't know what to say. David reached out, hesitantly at first, then with more confidence as Ethan didn't pull away. He placed his hand on his son's shoulder, squeezing gently. You don't have to say anything, son. Just give me a chance to prove that I mean what I say. That's all I'm asking for. Ethan nodded, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. Okay, he said softly. Okay, Dad. I'd like that. They sat there for a long moment, the weight of unspoken words and years of hurt slowly lifting. Then, surprising them both, Ethan leaned in and hugged his father. David wrapped his arms around his son, holding him close, feeling the tremors that ran through both their bodies. When they finally pulled apart, both their eyes were red, but there was a lightness between them that hadn't been there before, a sense of possibility, of hope. Come on, David said, standing and offering Ethan a hand up. Let's head back to the cabin. I think it's time we looked through those photo albums you mentioned. As they walked back, the forest seemed brighter somehow, the air fresher. They talked about Ethan's plans for college, his dreams of becoming an artist, and for the first time in years, David felt like he was truly listening, truly present. The rest of their time at the cabin passed in a blur of shared memories, laughter, and sometimes tears. They pored over old photos, David filling in the gaps in Ethan's memories with stories of Sarah, of their early years as a family. They tried, and failed spectacularly, to recreate more of Sarah's recipes, filling the cabin with the scent of slightly burnt cookies and the sound of their laughter. On their last night, as they sat by the fire, Ethan turned to his father with a serious expression. Dad, I've been thinking, when we get back home, I want to see a therapist. David nodded, understanding the courage it took for Ethan to voice this. I think that's a great idea, son. In fact, if you're open to it, maybe we could see someone together to help us work through everything? Ethan's smile was small but genuine. Yeah, I'd like that. As they packed up the next morning, preparing to return to their lives in the city, there was a sense of both excitement and trepidation. The cabin had been a cocoon of sorts, a safe space for them to begin rebuilding their relationship. The real test would come in the days and weeks ahead.